I recently did a little comparison with the new Glenmorangie 12 with the older Glenmorangie 10, which it's replaced. Have you seen the film Inception? You know that meme of, we need to go deeper, we need to go another layer down? I kind of thought that I might do that with this Glenmorangie. I found this one at auction. This isn't one that I've kept for a very long time. I believe that this one is from the 1990s. I don't think that it's any earlier than that. And it definitely looks older than what I remember, because I started buying this stuff mid-2000s, probably about 2004, 2005, and I think that what I used to buy looked very similar to this, but not quite the same. So it should be interesting to do another little comparison, going one step further back in time. This is the old standard expression from Glenmorangie. Almost too many bottles of whiskey in here. Let's give you a close-up of the label, because it is a thing of beauty. This is Glenmorangie as I remember it, with the curved label on the neck. 10 years old, little picture of the distillery itself. Single Malt Scotch Whisky. And a massive picture of the stills themselves. Because as I've said before, back in the 90s and early 2000s, it was really all the rage for various distilleries to harp on about how their stills were unique, and their unique stills were the reason why their whiskey was better than everyone else's and you should buy it. And interestingly, I think it's on the tube, this metal tube, it says that they are swan-necked stills are unique at nearly 17 feet, because back then we were still widely using imperial. Our stills ensure that only the lightest and purest vapours can ascend and condense into spirit. Also tells us about the American white oak casks. Interesting that they don't refer to it as a bourbon cask or a bourbon barrel. They do further down, but American white oak is the first thing. And also interesting that they say that the American bourbon casks will not mask the true character of Glenmorangie. So interesting that Glenmorangie, the distillery that's widely behind a lot of the impetus to change towards cask finishes and cask-heavy whiskey, back then was saying that a bourbon cask was great because it wouldn't hide the character of the spirit. A little bit about their water source. Cadbol barley. And also interesting that on this tube it says, our homegrown barley is supremely rich in flavour and malted in a lightly peated kiln. Glenmorangie! Which imparts a subtle smokiness to this whiskey. So, in my opinion, it's almost worth me buying this at auction, because I only paid about £30 for this. Someone has kept this for about 30 years in a cupboard, unopened, and I've bought it for probably not much more than they paid for it in the 90s. Certainly no more than I paid for the Glenmorangie 12 quite recently. And it kind of feels almost worth the price of admittance just to have this tin and see the old label. Never mind the actual whiskey that's in the bottle. And I do love that about auctions. I'm not a huge fan of auctions because I think that you quite often end up paying too much, especially when you add fees on. But these old bottles that no one really cares about, you can sometimes get real value out of them. And on the subject of tins, I will say, if anyone out there has got whiskey in tins on their shelf, or you buy these at auction, think twice before you throw these away, because it will not be long until it's hard to find whiskey in tins, and things like this, whether you keep the bottle and the contents or not, whiskey tins are going to be a hard to find little curiosity in the whiskey world. I myself have started keeping some of these just as little storage things and little ornaments, because it's a nice little thing to have that we're not going to have for much longer. Also in the tin was this nice little booklet, and you can actually see some of the 16 Men of Tain on here. being the 16 men who run the distillery, with a lot of those jobs being passed down from father to son. And you can actually see them there hunting wild bourbon casks with spears. A lot of people don't even realise that that's how you get a genuine bourbon cask. Obviously these days bourbon casks have sadly been hunted to near extinction in Scotland. So that's another little slice of history. Inside the booklet, there's a little questionnaire, a little bit of market research there, with the promise that if you fill in this questionnaire and send it back, you get a free tasting notebook and a complimentary £1 voucher towards Glenmorangie 18-year-old. £1? I don't know how much Glenmorangie 18 cost back then, but I'm assuming it was a lot cheaper than it is now, because £1 off does not seem very good. Also interesting that on the questionnaire it asks you which brand of malt whisky do you personally drink. Please tick appropriate boxes in each column, and the options are Glenmo 10, Glenmo 18, Glenfiddich and Macallan. Because apparently, them's the options. There is actually a space underneath other, please specify, but interesting that back then they clearly thought that their customers would either be die-hard Glenmorangie fans or they'd be on Fiddich or Macallan. I would assume that if you ask the majority of people now, Macallan would probably not be on that list, unless you're asking a very specific type of customer. On to the whisky though. You may have noticed that the cork on the top here is not the cork that came with this whisky, because this is a 30-year-old, roughly, bottle of whisky, and the original cork snapped as soon as I tried to take it out. That is just one of the hazards of buying old bottles of whisky, and the main reason to keep old bottles and old corks on hand, so you've always got backup. I am a little bit hesitant to review and even open this one though, and the reason for that is that I have noticed a worrying trend lately that whenever I try a re-released whisky or compare an old bottle to a contemporary version, the new whisky just seems to be getting worse. We saw it a little bit between this one and this one, at least I think we did, and we've seen it with a lot of other whiskies as well. We're getting less and paying more, not just because of inflation, but in real terms we're paying more and quality is just lower. From my experience, I've seen it with Highland Park, with the 1980s Highland Park that I reviewed a while ago being absolutely phenomenal. Seen it with Glenlivet 18, Lafroig 18. In a way, I think the new style is different, but I think that in a way we've seen a drop in quality in some terms with Ardbeg, Bruichladdich 10, Glenfiddich, Old Pulteney. In my humble opinion, the only distilleries that spring to mind that have meaningfully and consistently improved over the last 20 years, in my opinion, would be Loch Lomond and perhaps Bunnahabhain. So I am slightly apprehensive about this one. And obviously I know the result because I've been drinking this, I've tried it, because I do my preparations before these videos. But before I got to it, there's always the possibility that an old bottle of whisky will just not be great. Like I had the vintage, slightly vintage, an old bottling of Black Bottle recently, and that just, it was a bit underwhelming. But also, on the other hand, if we try this, and it's absolutely phenomenal, where the hell do you go for your next bottle? Auction, I suppose. I should really stock up on these before I tell you guys what I think about it. Not that I'm that influential. I'm not Ralphie or anything. So Glenmorangie old edition. I think from about the 90s. It's a 700ml bottle and it's stated as 40% ABV. So I don't think it's from any earlier than 1990 by that. It may just be from this century, but I think it's a 90s edition. Old Glenmo 10 on the nose. Rich, really rich, intense and expressive malt. It's got that waxy, old, and profound. It's got that old, waxy candle wax, oily maltiness that you get from a whiskey which has been in a cask for a really long time. Candle wax, really vibrant, intense green apples. Here's one for the Brits, strawberry chewits. That super sweet, slightly sour and really intense punch in the face strawberry, really grab your taste buds confectionery note. And also quite smoky, a surprising amount of peat on this, which, I'll be honest, I don't remember getting any peat on Glenmorangie in the early 2000s. I think this is a little bit older than that, so I guess the cut-off line when they stopped using peat on their malt is somewhere around the very early 2000s. Because there is a distinct smokiness to this one. Not extremely peaty as such, but there's a definite stale smoke note. Stale smoke and stale smoked barley and a slightly stale residual smokiness and a medicinal salve and bandage quality. Very creamy. Caramel, creme brulee. But so expressive and fizzy and vibrant. A little bit of a lemon sherbet note on the nose. Lemon sherbet maltiness. Fizzy, malty, explosive. This really comes across as like a 20-year-old version of this one. But I've had Glenmorangie 18, and this stuff is miles better than any recent Glenmorangie 18 that I've ever had. Which really raises the question, how good was the 1990s Glenmo 18 that it mentioned in this book? If this stuff seems like it's been top dressed to hell with old stock, then just how good was that 18? So that is enough about the nose. I'll show you a little close-up of the whiskey. Do you think that's natural colour? I think it looks hazier than the other, like the modern Glenmos that we've had. So maybe the chill filtration was less back then, or possibly not at all. I think it's still reasonably clear, so possibly still chill filtered, but probably not as much. As for the colouring, it looks probably about as natural as this one did. But again, I don't think there's any guarantees, so that's all speculation. Let's see how this stuff tastes. Overwhelmingly rich, oily, fruity, bucket loads of old malt, oily, waxy. Again, the lightest and most delicate smoke with a fleeting farmy twang. The arrival is coating and full. More of those green apples, creamy, buttery, silky mouthfeel. Really explosive, appley, oily, waxy malt. The kind of thing that you normally only get when a whiskey gets to about 20 years. And more of that slightly stale, creamy smokiness. I do think that it runs out of steam on the late palate, possibly because of the low ABV, but it's just simply lovely. Let's have one more sip and look at the finish. Lots and lots of old malt. A little bit of a cardboardy note. Just a slight damp cardboard and a little bit of walnut. A whiff of apples and oak. It is quite light on the finish, and the finish is definitely no more than medium. But really, when a whiskey is this good, who cares? So the verdict, absolutely insane. Stupidly, stupidly good. Significantly better than the old 10, which replaced this. And frankly, unrecognisable when compared to the modern 12. This is just an entirely different whiskey. Different in every way compared to any of the modern Glenmorangies. And without a doubt, there is absolutely a healthy amount of older stock being used to top dress this. There is... We can all be wrong, we can all be tricked and misled, but there is no way that what is in this bottle is anywhere near 10 years old. It is much older than that, at least on average. I really like this whiskey. I think that it's an absolute stunner, and it reminds me a bit of, because of that light peatiness and the stale, smoky creaminess and the slight farminess and the strong malt, it quite reminds me of like a Ben Nevis. Like a Ben Nevis, like you can get now, but older and richer. I don't think that this is one that if you buy it and keep it, it's going to go up in value. I just don't. I think that there's too many of them around. It's too common. And people, I can't imagine people being excited about this to the point where it's ever going to earn you a return on your investment. But if you're watching this and this sounds good to you, it's absolutely worth buying to open and drink, because it seems like you can buy these for a really fair price because they're just not being sought after, and it's such an experience. And perhaps most of all, apart from the fact that the quality of this stuff is just absolutely stellar, one of the most interesting things about this is that it's peated. Maybe there's some long-term Glenmo fans out there that aren't going to be surprised about this, but I was, because I don't think I've ever had a peated Glenmorangie before. And it's just really surprising to me that not that long ago, the standard expression from Glenmorangie had a fair, very noticeable amount of peat in it. Glenmorangie, which is kind of the epitome of light and gentle, almost bland, used to be lightly peated and explosively flavoursome. I can't say a bad thing about the modern Glenmorangie range, because I think that for the price that you pay, they offer a great experience, if that is the kind of experience that you're seeking, but they really have nothing in common with this one. And if I'm honest, it kind of makes me question the future of whiskey a little bit. Old whiskey wasn't always better, but there's a clear pattern here that 20 or 30 years ago, we got a hell of a lot more for our money than we do these days. And it's not even just that. The level of quality that you get in this bottle is hard to find at any price point now. And the same goes for Bruichladdich Laddie 10 and Arran 14 and the old Ardbeg 10. I don't like to say this because I care about whiskey, but things like this really do remind you that, at least in a lot of ways, we kind of get a raw deal these days. Obviously, we get a huge variety of whiskey to choose from these days, and transparency and presentation is better than ever. And at least a lot of us, definitely here in the UK, we are enjoying very easy access to a very wide range of distilleries, both in the UK and from across the world. But if you wanted to source something similar to this now, I think that it's going to cost you a bare minimum £100 to get a contemporary bottle with this kind of flavour profile, and probably closer to 150 if you can even find something comparable to this at all. I think that on the one hand we do forget how fortunate we are with our options these days, but we also clearly and sadly forget that quality has dipped more than many realise too. And I think I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to really enjoy the rest of this bottle, and I'm going to go off now and really enjoy the rest of this glass before I get too nostalgic and negative. Let me know what you think about this topic in general, this bottling, if you remember it. Do you remember it being significantly better? Because it's always difficult. Sometimes you come away from an expression, you go back to it years later and you don't see the changes. Sometimes, like me with when I was talking about the Jamesons that I reviewed recently, you see the changes as you're buying it and that makes you go off it. I'd be interested to hear if there's anyone that noticed the changes kind of between this and this. And do you agree with me that despite everything that we are lucky and that we can be thankful about with modern whiskey, I think that standard expressions are just a pale shadow of what we used to get. Let me know your thoughts. See you next time. Cheers.